Hi, thanks very much for being here. Just really want to acknowledge you for coming out as coaches. And I know it's Sunday morning, and it's tough to get out of bed on a Sunday morning, and there's definitely stuff you had to give up in order to be here. So whether it's sleep, time with family, it could be money through work, personal time with your teams, and really aware of that and acknowledging that you gave that up to be here today, and your commitment to your own development as a coach, but also the development to those athletes and the commitment to those athletes that you're making by being here over either today or the next couple of days, and really present to that. So really appreciate you being here, coming with a mind to share, and I think that's where we flew over the ocean with that commitment as well to share with you. So if there's any questions at any time, please just let us know. Love to answer it. Both Mike and I love talking about basketball, and if we can fulfill that in any way, please go ahead, put your hand up in that sense. So what we're going to start today is a little bit of theory. We want to set up the next couple days, and in doing that, we'll be talking about the LTAD and also how to integrate it into your program. So just making sure that, now this is not working. Oh, there we go. It's just the angle. So, Mike's here, and Mike's primary job is working with women's high performance, currently working with women's high performance. And so really looking at the development of our women's national team, getting them to the podium, and everything that fulfills around it. And he'll expand a little bit more about that, and you'll be hearing from Mike around those. So that's, his perspective in coming into a lot of this. My role at Canada Basketball is domestic development. So taking some of the information that comes back with our national teams, some of the gaps that come up, and how can we close those gaps domestically throughout our country. So that goes with player development, coach development, as well as officials development. And what can we do in integrating, manipulating, switching to help close those gaps for our international presence, and working hand in hand in a federation to do that. And so if there's any questions around that, please let us know. And then I also work with consulting, sometimes with different federations or clubs, curriculum development, and so I've been doing that as well. So our contact information's there, and both Mike and I are open to any sort of questions and emails. Our biggest constraint is time, trying to get to everybody. So I always say, if I haven't responded, send me another email. It is absolutely not offensive to me. It's coming through that queue. So if you send it again, and Mike's the same way, we're more than happy to help out in any way that we can. So should have learned this one already. Where we're starting is really with the spine of what we've been doing with our programs, and really trying to integrate this and within this whole every session that we're doing, and spending this morning a little bit on this who plus why, and how important that is, and how the LTAD gets really integrated and comes out and facilitates that who and why, and looking at the second half of this equation, equaling the what and how. And the what and how, often when we go into planning and coaching, is what we start diving into first. Like, what are we doing and how are we going to do it? But we're really working on a player-centered approach. And in doing a player-centered approach, you actually start on the left-hand side of that equation with who are you coaching and why are they there, or why am I doing what am I going to do? In terms of coaching. It's really around that purposeful planning as a coach. So not just having that practice plan, this is what we're going to do. Why am I doing, and why am I making those choices, and looking at the depth of that. And I think this has been a huge change with what we're trying to do in Canada, is really looking at that who and why, and taking the long-term athlete development, which is really what that is, and how that changes depending on the age and stage that you're looking at. And I think also fundamentally the last piece, just setting this all up, is around really acknowledging that we're coaching people that are playing basketball, right? As opposed to we're going in and coaching players. And I think that mentality, working with our national team as well as our grassroots programs, is a different mentality and philosophy when we're approaching programming and what we're doing. And so I think it's really important to always be grounded in that we are coaching people and people to play basketball, and really growing them as a full athlete and a full person, changes what you actually do within that program. Anything? So this question is, what can we do in order to build, this ideal basketball players, that on the extreme end will go and impact on an international stage in some of the best leagues in the world, but also fulfill the development of basketball players within that sort of pyramid underneath them, supporting the entire system. And so this is a question we've been really asking within our federation. In about the year 2000, our federation turned around and said, and created what we called our 2020 vision. And so where are we going to be in 20 years? Where is our federation going to be? And one of the goals was to get onto the podium. And so Tokyo is a really big moment for us, and we really go back to that and figure out what we need to do in order to get there. And it's been a long pathway in order to do this. And one of the things that really made a big impression and has made a lot of impact is this idea around this long-term athlete development. And using that as a spine, it has really created the philosophy of what we're doing with a lot of these and how we are able to create and get to that 2020 vision. And both our men's and women's programs are really, men have just qualified for the World Championships, so we're pretty happy about that. And now just working on their ranking, getting into the World Championships. And the women just came out of the World Cup. And so, looking to re-qualify, which I'm sure they will. So we're in that position, but I'll tell you what, 20 years ago, we had absolutely no business talking about this. No business at all. And that's what the difference of this LTAD has really made within our entire system. So I want to share with you how that came to be and how you can do it within even your individual programs. It doesn't have to be a national movement. It could be a movement within your own space, and talk about that. And really this long-term athlete development is a bit of a philosophy around, and we'll talk about this and break this out onto the court, but drills approach versus games approach. So those are some of the concepts we'll take a look, and the philosophy comes out of this. So that's sort of what you do based on who, going back to that equation, who you're working with. And, really looking at retention, trying to transfer and have the athletes retain, and how do you do that within the coaching based on who you're working with. And so those are some of the components within your building of the practice that we find that's really important. Anything about the philosophy? Nope. Be real close here. So, like I said, this has been a long working process here, and so this is just a bit of a diagram to give you a bit of a picture. When we talk about us in the 70s, as in Canada Basketball, us, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, even early 2000s, we would have random showings at Olympics. We had some, good players. Some of you might know Steve Nash. He, showed up in Canada and within the NBA, and we had some athletes, playing in some of these top leagues. It wasn't consistent. It wasn't predictable. Sometimes we'd qualify through FIBA Americas in order to go to World Championships, but it wasn't something that we knew that was going to occur every time. And it depended on the athletes that were there, who showed up, what kind of training camps we had put on, and it wasn't something that, every year we're looking at it. In 2002, our government put in mandatory long-term athlete development into every sport. And so it was definitely government-driven, but like I said, I truly believe now, knowing it, that you can actually make a difference in your own space. But we were in the space where the government threw it in at us, and we had to do it. So all of a sudden, we had to make all these changes. And so we put it in 2002, and you can see, so this graph is how many athletes we had in the NBA, per year, kind of going through this graph here. And you can see that it's not like we put it in 2002 and 2004, all of a sudden we had all this production. The whole idea around LTAD, or long-term athlete development, is that it's long-term. It actually does, and now we can look on a graph and see that it does take time in order to produce these sort of changes. And so, you think you put it into your program this season, and next season you should be a dominant program, or you see the growth, massive growth within your athletes. It actually is going to take some time, and to be patient with it in order to see the production. Whereas now what we can start to see is repeated, visits and attendance, to World Championships and all of our national levels, and it's almost part of a standard. And it's not because we turn around and we go out looking for the medal or being there. It's because of our commitment to the who and the why that's allowed us to get these results. And so we'll just talk about that build a little bit. But I think now we're also really proud to say that With our women's program, we have the most amount of women we've ever had around and within the WNBA and the top leagues around the world. Between the men and the women, we have over 200 athletes in the NCAA, and quite a few of them now, especially this year, making really big impacts in the NCAA. And with our men, we have the most amount of NBA players in the NBA outside of the US. And so when it goes to the amount of international players there, we're the country that's now developing most of them coming out of there. So, and having said that, we've got 4, maybe 5 likely into that international draft again this year. So, that number and the ability to produce these athletes have really come from the integration that happened in 2002. And now in 2018-19, we're really starting to see that difference. Like, it's literally taken that long to be able to see that. But now it's a consistent every draft, almost every draft year. Obviously, there's bubble years with development, but we're starting to get those athletes into the system. And so I really believe that with some of these concepts, and integration of these concepts, that you can do it within your own communities, your own spaces, and your own athletes. Any questions? Oh, remember this? So what I'm going to get you to do, this is what we use as our multi-sport LTAD sample. And this is what came out in that 2002. And I know here in England, there's an LTAD. I was looking at it and taking a look, and Ishvan Bali was very instrumental in creating and being involved in ours. And I know he was here doing it here as well. What I'm going to get you to do with someone beside you, either groups of 2 or 3, just talk about what you know about this diagram. What do you already know about it? So it might be something that you're taking visually off the diagram, stuff in there, and it's pretty obvious, and so now you know it. But it might be something that you've already learned through your own experiences. And so just with their partner, and one of the things I think, clinics is something that I put on in Canada, and I think one of the most valuable things about a clinic, like what you can leave from a clinic, is for sure information. I think commitment to understanding and teaching is really, really important within a clinic environment. But the other thing is the networking and finding someone new in your environment to bounce ideas off of and to increase and create this network within coaching. So I'd encourage you to turn around and reach to someone that you actually haven't met yet and that you don't know. Introduce yourself and then share, be vulnerable enough to share about what you know or what you don't know and learn something from someone else as well. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to introduce yourself to someone that maybe you know if it's starting early and you're not comfortable, or someone you don't know, and share a little bit about what you see or what you already know with that individual. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to get there. Okay, so I'm going to start pulling it back out again. It's great conversations, and I appreciate those that went outside their comfort zones to find someone new. So what are some of the things that within your conversations that got pulled out? So either something you brought to the conversation or something you were able to retrieve from the conversation. What was something someone want to share? Yeah. Can I just get your name so I can get to know you too? Scott, yeah, go ahead. Fundamentals, sometimes when it's executed, could not be fun for the individuals that are there. Good, great. I think I saw a hand here. Yeah, your name? Antonio, nice.
I kind of take it as I'm a teacher, and you kind of have to teach. You do all your basic core, and then it branches off to see with your 3 bottom lines. It branches off with the kids whatever they want to know.
So Antonio, just in case you guys can't hear, because I know he's not mic'd, he really commented how it starts sort of on these 3 levels, and it's building, and then there's a branch going off, and he, how it's consecutive, and then it kind of separates, come through the top. Yeah.
Hi, Kelly. I work mainly with girls.
Yeah.
I look at the fundamentals as in, first of all, get them interested in sport, and the fundamentals actually make the sport fun for them to stay.
Very cool observation. So just shared about how fundamentals, how that love of the game and the attraction to the game, and in your circumstance with females, how important that is at that stage, for sure. Yeah.
Hi. Yes.
Very cool. Yeah. So just noted that with Learn to Train is really focusing and emphasizing on how to train and teaching people how to be in training throughout that stage. Very cool. Yeah. Adam.
Just like not to move into excellence too early. Obviously, you go through those phases and not try and teach the 6-year-olds how to train to compete or train to win.
Sure. And just building on that piece is how, we go back to that equation. Who is it in these stages, right? And just to reiterate what you shared with us was, not to drive straight to excellence or elite or what's going on in one stage and try to apply it to a different stage, because, knowing who they are, what you're going to do is going to be different, right? And being really aware of that. Saw another hand. Yeah. Absolutely. So just repeating it to make sure everyone can hear is the importance of physical literacy, at this fundamental, down in these stages, in order to be able to best prepare the athlete in there to do that, and making sure, just building on what you shared with us, that we're not handcuffing the athlete's abilities, deadening a career or deadening their opportunities, as young as in some of these stages, by not integrating some of those physical literacies and fundamental movement skills. Absolutely, great observation. Maybe one more. We got one more? Yeah.
Chris, I think that's because training to win what often see because you've got a 12-year-old or a 6-year-old whack on the basket and that's the right thing.
Right. Yeah. So just shared with us is the idea of where learn to win and train to win fit in the development stage, as opposed to taking a 12-year-old, who might be taller, biologically taller, and putting them right underneath the basket, because that might be the strategy to win. And when does that get when does that start being integrated and looking at those stages? So what you're going to do, the what is putting them underneath the hoop, depending on who they are and knowing that stage. So that's really great. Thanks for sharing all those. So I'm going to build on this a little bit. So for sure, a lot of these things you guys were able to pick it out, and just acknowledging all the knowledge that we actually have in this room that obviously is quite thorough. So it's really great to see that everyone's awareness around this and starting to really reflect on who you are you're working with, whether it's with girls or 12-year-olds or elite athletes, and where they start fitting in all of this. So this is the multi-sport version of what we call the long-term athlete development. And there's a couple things I just want to share and build on some of the observations you already made. So for sure, starting at active start, looking at some of these development ages, biological ages. And so these are based on what we would determine as biological age. So starting from the day you're born, that's how that is determined. And active start, starting with 0 to 6 years old, so first touches the basketball, and then getting into fundamentals, learn to train as we build up, starting to look at some of the differences in the ages and development between males and females. And so that's where those ages start to switch. But generally between 6 to 9, 8 to 12, 11 to 15 or 16, and then building from there. So the other thing about this, and I know you sort of mentioned this, how it starts building this way, and you can really see through the colors that it comes up. And once we get into this learn to train, act to start fundamentals, for sure the importance of physical literacy that we picked up on, and the first contact that you picked up on, and really getting athletes to love physical activity for sure, and love the game, and really looking at fun ways for them to train. Because even if you were to train them to an elite, let's say, level, or you totally prepared them but they didn't love the game, they're going to stop. And the biggest dropout age in basketball, particularly for sure in Canada, is this train to train stage. And so if we don't do our job here, these ideas where you're like, within my club, once we get to these 14-year-olds, they start looking at other options. So things like jobs or video games, which is a big competitor right now. And sometimes we have to look as someone who delivers sport or delivers basketball, how am I responsible in that outcome? And are we doing what we need to do in these stages to make sure that doesn't occur? So we can look for reasons outside, so whether that's the job or school or demands or this, that, maybe they change to another sport to specialize in. But what am I doing and what's my responsibility around that too? So looking at your program and how do you build that love of the game through those earlier stages so that when it gets to that choice, that love is present in that choice. And so it's really hard to turn down the game in that space. So when we get to the train-to-train stage, this starts going in also horizontal fashion. So it does build up, but it does go horizontal. So we've got this sort of active for life, and that might look like going outside, grabbing a ball on an outdoor hoop and playing a little bit. It might be in the gym or at recess, grabbing a ball and playing with some friends. And so, basketball is present, but it's, this active for life and just being involved in sport, which is also very important, especially if they're potentially in another sport, especially in another sport. Having this active start fundamentals, learn to train base allows them to be active for life in basketball. Competitive for my life might look like, a low-level league or a house league. As we get up in biological age, it might look like a men's league or a women's league or a YMCA league. And it might look like some of those activities that people are doing where you're still playing games, you might practice, you might not, and it's a lower sort of competitive for life. And that area, is actually one of the tasks that I'm trying to develop more within our country, because I do want athletes to have a place that when they're in some of these stages to play for life. I don't want it that you go to university or you stop. And one of the areas that I think, some of our European counterparts actually do a really good job. Like France is a great example with all of their leagues all the way down, League 1, League 2, League 3, that, people say they play in the French league, but they practice once a week and have one game a week, and they still have their full-time job and they have their family, but they're actually in this competitive for life, and that's an area that I'm looking to try and help develop within our own country. Based on what other people are doing. And then as we start moving horizontal, we start getting, for lack of a more generic term, maybe your single A train-to-train team, your double A, your triple A. And as a national federation, we deal with this. This is our cadet national team right here. It's very, 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 very slim. So you can see there's a whole ton of people that we have to consider outside of it. But when we talk about national team, we're literally talking about that train-to-train horizontal all the way to the left of that diagram towards excellence. And it's a very, very small, slender population compared to everything else that's going on. And some of those in that sliver in train to train might go up to that elite spot in train to compete, but they might actually start going back this way too, depending on how they end up develop, and they might go straight into competitive for life, depending on what happens. And so knowing that it's not sort of just up, 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 that it's kind of, you're zigzagging through, and they might come in, they might be competitive for life for a little bit, and they might end up back on a national team. And that it's not a complete linear pathway, and that we have to be flexible enough for people to jump in and out, and provide programming and support and instruction and awareness of who they are, so we know what to do for those individuals as we're kind of going through those places. Any questions with this model? So, sorry, I should actually wait. Any questions? No, we're good? Yep.
Someone who jumps in bed, like a 14-year-old used to start, they have to jump straight into like learn to train. You guys practice start. What happened with those?
So really great question, and one that comes up even, Canada's a huge geography when we take a look at it, and I'll start talking about ages a little bit and relative ages, but this is a good model to be able to look at relativity between. And so you might have a 14-year-old that comes in, and so on this biologically fits at that train to train, starting to go into train to compete. But if you look at their relative age, their ability compared to the other people within their biological year set, they might not actually be a train to train. So we've got a couple northern territories, Yukon and Northwest Territories, in the north of our province, and I'm sure that's the same within most countries where, sport is not as prevalent in certain regions. So, when, let's say I travel there or work with them, I know that their athletes biologically fit in the train to train and train to compete stages, but when I go into delivery, I might be delivering something at a learn to train stage. And so knowing who you are coaching will dictate what you're going to do. And that's why that key is important. So it was a really great observation.
Yeah. Just to comment on that, you have to be careful that you're only looking at the basketball side. You have to also look at the social emotional. Because the opposite happens too. You have this kid who looks like they're in the NBA already. 15-year-old boy who looks like he has a body in the NBA. But his mind and his maturity is maybe at a 12-year-old, right? So you just don't look at it from the basketball. You have to look at it because one of the worst things you can do with a player who their peer group is maybe a 15, 16-year-old is say, I'm going to put you back with 12-year-olds because that's where your basketball is. They're going to quit because their peer group is, so you have to more be able to individualize that to meet their needs.
Good. So the thing about the LTAD, so oh, sorry, did you have your hand up? Oh, no. Yeah?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, just in case you didn't hear, the comment was that it also depends on who you're relating it to and how that might change where they fit. So they might be very good within their school program, but if they went to a club program or if you put them into another geography, they might actually not be as dominant, and how culturally that changes within some of those geographic spaces, for sure. Great observation there. Appreciate that. So this is actually the multi-sport version. So all of our sports use this kind of version, but the most important thing that I believe gets gapped out with the LTAD integration into programs is that you actually have to figure out how to make it live within your space. And so it's great to know this, but it's a whole nother thing to apply it. And so that's really what we started to get into doing. And so we realized that in basketball, from the multi-sport version, we're missing a gap in age, and this is this learn to win stage. And that's actually a very, very relevant stage for us because that's really the university, when they're playing in university, and we don't want to jump straight from high school, so this 18-year-old right into, and it's different in different areas, right, to go right into pro. That's not an option in Canada. And so we had to really look at this model and say, again, who are we doing it and why are we building it this way? And what's the philosophy between all of these pieces? And so we realized that this is a different stage and it looks very different than some of our athletes that after their 1 to 4 years university might go into a pro situation. And that might look different. What's training and what's going on in that stage might look different. So we added a stage in there. And so that's how our LTAD differs. And of course we put someone who's important to us into our LTAD as well as a model of such things. So this is what our LTAD starts to look like. You know, sometimes Steve's in there, sometimes he's not, but you know, really representing what we're trying to do in implementing this LTAD. So you can see that we've got that learn to win before the train to win stage. And so that there might be some learning before we get into training around that winning, and that could occur at that university stage. And that's where they are with doing that. Anything on about this? Okay. So not only within the LTAD, there's actually 10 components, and this is where you start to get them to live a little bit. So understanding who it is in there and how to do that, but then taking these 10 components and applying it to the LTAD and then applying it to your context. And so the first one's physical literacy. So you know, kind of noted how at the bottom of the pyramid is a huge emphasis on it in order to allow people to move through it. Specialization is another one, around specialization in sport and what does that look like. Developmental age, and that's going to go into some of the talk about the relative age and the biological age and those things that you can track. Sensitive periods, which you know, Alex and I got to talk a little bit about this leading into it, and some topics about you know, how reliable is it, and do we do the things in order to actually find sensitive periods within athletes, but that's another key component there. This is the one that Mike was kind of talking about a little bit, and a lot often gets sort of jumped over. Like we'll do the token things as coaches around the mental and cognitive development, and that's again going back and linking back to the idea that we're actually coaching players or people. right? Not necessarily basketball athletes. And how, if you really want to coach the person, you have to make sure all of these pieces, that emotional development's really coming through. And again, when you're identifying someone that might biologically look older, checking in on this mental and cognitive emotional development, how important those components. When we start to look at, and to be honest, it's not just with the athletes, one of the major tasks this year I have is actually with our officials, and how do we get more officials on the national stage. With that 2020 vision, we said we want to be on the world stage, but it's actually not just with our national teams. We want to be on the world stage in everything. So we want to be leading in coaching development, we want to be leading in referee development, we want our referees being present at the Olympics, as well as our coaches and our athletes. And so one of those things is taking a look at, again, we are developing people that are officiating. And so what are their gaps even in terms of emotional and cognitive development, and what can we do to support those sort of pieces? And so it really applies to all of those areas. It's very transferable there. Periodization, so again, this is looking at that second half of that equation. What are you doing? Okay, when are you doing it? And really very present to that purposeful planning. Competition, this is a huge one. What kind of competition is going on within that LTAD? I'll talk about that after we get into some of these other. Excellence takes time, and we are absolute proof of that. Excellence is going to take time. This is not a turnkey solution. This is a long-term commitment, and at times can test your commitment to it. And so really looking at how many hours it really takes, and what components need to be placed, but even checked on to make sure that's being integrated throughout these changes. Alignment and integration is one of the ones that are, this is one that we're still working on this, but the more you can get things aligned, the more powerful the changes are going to be. And when Mike actually had my job before I had my job, and one of his biggest challenges is we had multiple different rule sets being played within our country. So we had federation rules, NCAAs, we had versions of NBA rules, we had FIBA rules, we had versions of all of those played all over. So athletes wouldn't necessarily know which rule set they're going into all the time. And with that alignment and some of the changes that Mike's been able to make, we were able to be much more powerful in terms of teaching coaches to one rule set and around that. And so that alignment piece is one that we forget often, but that is one of the most powerful ones in order to make this change. And knowing too that alignment, again, I know sometimes I'll walk away from interactions and they're like, well, our country doesn't do anything, or our government doesn't do it, and they need to put this in. But alignment doesn't necessarily have to work from the top. It could be you within your club and one other team within the club in that commitment. Or it could be your club and maybe another club, actually, and that is right there, that's an alignment. And so being committed, maybe not to that immediate win, but actually to the growth of the game within your community in working with those other clubs, right? And so that's what alignment could work like in your context as well.
Dawn,
please.
One of the other key ones on alignment is knowing who is below and who is above you. So where are your athletes coming from and where are they going to? And what I've always said to coaches is, you should not be the reason why someone cannot play at the next level. I want you to think about that. You should not be the reason why they do not play. Now, they choose not to play, that's fine. But if you're the reason they're quitting because you did not develop the skills and the passion and the love or the fundamental movement skills, that means you were not aligned with the next level of play. Unless you're very, very fortunate, no one here is probably a pro coach who gets the cream of the crop at the train win. Most of us are somewhere in that developmental stage, and we have to know how I'm aligned. But I also have to know what's below me, and how am I aligning with those groups below me to help them bring players in that are ready to play at that level. So that can be without the government, without another agency, just knowing who those are. And that's a very, very powerful alignment, building those relationships.
So today, we could probably spend an hour on each one of these topics and how it can be integrated and all this sort of things. But we're going to touch on 3 and then talk about them. But then this afternoon, Mike and I will go on the court and show what it looks like in practice. And so wanted to give the theory first so that we don't have to go back to that, I guess. And it just lays the groundwork a little bit. So we're going to work with the first 3. So physical literacy. is definitely an important part, and we're going to talk about that and how does it show up in practice and planning. Specialization and developmental age. So those are the three we're going to work on. Mike and I are kicking around throughout the next couple days, so if you have questions in any other spaces, we're more than happy to talk about it and share about it, or at time during questions as well. So just starting with physical literacy, and that's the first one that we're going to take a look at. And I know, you pointed out in that LTAD model how important it is, but let's really dive into the importance about physical literacy and fundamental movement skills. And if you take a look at, on the left-hand side, we've got different sort of classifications of sports. So, from aerial sports to team sports, to combative sports, and down the left-hand side. And then through the top, we have different fundamental movement skills. So it's like agility, balance, coordination, running, jumping. Those are just a couple of the fundamental movement skills. And you can see which sort of groups of sports train what FMS skills. And I think there's a couple things that stand out in this that I just want to point out. One, there's gaps, right? One sport or one classification of sport doesn't necessarily automatically train all these FMS skills. Because basketball is the greatest game in the world, clearly, and is one of the team sports, we're actually doing a pretty good job. But there's two in there. One is around dance and rhythm. One could argue maybe defensive rotations might be a nice dance that goes on within your team. Sometimes it's a tragic dance, but swimming's the other one that doesn't necessarily show up there. So the idea of survival within a water environment doesn't necessarily show up within a basketball game. And so, but a lot of these other ones do. Now, that's with the assumption that the coach is actually working and developing some of these, right? That they're actually getting touched, and those are getting integrated in those pieces. But the other thing I just want to point out is that some of these can be developed while they're playing other sports. So, this idea of having an athlete playing in basketball or within your program all the year round doesn't have to necessarily be that way. Knowing that which sport they're in, what's maybe occurring, and what are those transfer skills gives you that sort of knowledge. And the importance of understanding that and allowing that for it to develop, that they're not wasting their time when they're with another sport. But I think it's what's neat. And, one of the things we're starting to work with our coaches in Canada, this idea around IPP, individual player plan or performance plan. And knowing, again, what your athlete's doing. So if they play on, happen to be on the rowing team, what is it that they're developing there that's going to help them as a basketball player, and how can you help them transfer those skills, and being aware of who you're coaching, and that's the depth of knowing who you're coaching and helping those transfer with those skills. So what I'm going to get you to do is to actually pair up with someone you didn't work with. So it might mean you have to move a little bit out of your seat, but it'll give you a chance to get some oxygen through that brain there. And this is the task I'm going to ask you to do, is to pick one of these three rows. So we've got sort of top row, middle row, bottom row. And to think about a basketball competition, so your team in competition. And I want you to take a look at, so if I'm going through the first row, take a look at agility, balance, coordination, speed, jumping, and climbing. Where does that show up in competition with my athletes? Or if you're not working with athletes maybe right now, or maybe not in a competition, think of a game environment and what shows up. And so I just want you to have that conversation with someone new. If you could rotate to do that. Go ahead, I'll give you like 1 to 2 minutes there to get that done. Okay, so I'm just going to start pulling stuff out. There's some really good conversations going on, so I was able to eavesdrop a little bit. Who changed to a new partner? Who changed? Great, just want to acknowledge you for getting out of that comfort zone and doing that, so thanks for doing that. So as you start to go through these and try to find where they show up in competition, because again, when we go to build practice, we want things to transfer to the game, right? At the end of the day, it's the game that we're developing these athletes for. And so if this stuff doesn't show up in the game, then why would we integrate it into a practice, right? So really wanted to take the time to see how important and where do the FMS skills show up in competition. So were there any, so some of them are really obvious, right? So, agility, coming off screens, so many places that agility shows up. But were there any that came up as a challenge or a discussion point? Were there any that, kind of went back and forth and you're like, I'm not sure if this shows up? Yeah. Pardon? Swimming. Thoughts on swimming? Anyone taught that swim move before? Right? And you think about, that shoulder, being able to, the strength within the shoulder, being able to get around, happens sometimes with posting up within the key, happens, if someone's boxing me out, trying to swim that, that arm that's up. So if like Mike's here in front boxing me out, right? Let's swim illegally to lock him out of that rebound there. So yeah, that swim move, although not necessarily the idea around being able to survive and tread water, but see how some of those skills do actually transfer into competition in our game. Any others? Whoa, that was a tough one.
Don, just real quick.
Yeah.
But if I had an athlete who was a swimmer, what strength do they bring to the basketball game? Their upper body shoulder strength, and their shoulder flexibility, like its strength. Right. Like we get too many basketball players who start to play like this because they're doing this all the time, and their shoulders are like this. And that ability to open up my shoulders and really have that shoulder flexibility to rebound and grab rebounds comes from players who have shoulder strength and shoulder flexibility.
And just to build onto the idea around cardiovascular training, and that they bring that in as well, their endurance that they'd bring. So that idea. Sorry, did someone say another one? Was there another one that came up? Yeah. Climbing. Yeah, so this one can be tough and might show up in some populations over the other. Hanging on the rim, rebounding, that climbing. Upper body strength can transfer for sure, trying to fight through different things, but definitely a bit of a tougher, it doesn't show up as much as some of these other places, there's no question with that. Any other ones that were tough? Yeah. Really, that's funny because I see my athletes do that a lot. Just kidding. Yeah, where would walking come into play? Anyone have ideas around the walking? Change of speed, change of pace. So, again, maybe not in every play, but that idea of being able to go this pace and then that pace and leading my defense into a space that they might not want to be, for sure. Any other tough ones? Totally. Gates and walking and jumping and all those, the comment was that, sometimes the walking gait is off, but jumping and running and so many of these places too. The other one I just wanted to pull out is this idea around throwing, but throwing with an apparatus. So, we have the picture of the lacrosse stick, Canada. But this idea of being able to throw an object from that sport sort of outside from, it's going from the netting within that racket. But, it happens in some other racket sports. And the importance around that is being able to control the ball not tight within your body. So being able to make those extended finishes and being able to make those extended passes and figuring out how to control objects away from your body and not close together to your body, and how that can transfer and really elevate, to be honest, into creativity for an athlete, being able to have that skill set. So, when you take a look at these, how many of these show up and how important it is to actually have an emphasis on it. And again, these are some of the differences between an okay player and a player that can control the ball out here. That is a good player. Right? And those come from these fundamental movement skills, and that's why these sort of things. So what does it look like in our space? Not just knowing that they're important. So maybe we'll do this. Starting to take a look at, there's quite a few FMS skills, and looking at them in 3 different categories. So we look at locomotive skills, FMS skills, object control, and then the finest one is around balance movements. And so kind of starting to categorize them into 3 components. And as a coach, this is where I would challenge you to take a look at your practice plan. Every once in a while, do a self-check on what I am doing based on who I'm coaching, on that other side of that equation that I put at the very beginning. And how many of these are showing up within my training, knowing that we just went through this exercise, that they show up in competition, and that I want my training environment to reflect what's going on in competition. And so, again, going back on this philosophy of the LTAD, it's great to know that FNS is important, but what are we doing with it? What does that actually look like for us? And how are we emphasizing these? So, things like, punting, rolling, striking, some of these, catching, stopping, are those points of emphasis within the drill sets that we're doing, knowing that that's going to make a difference within your competition and for that athlete. Anything on these ones?
Well, take a look at the locomotor skills. What I do a lot of times when I go mentor a coach is I'll do an inventory for them on, let's say, the locomotor skills. But then I challenge the coach, say in warm-up, how many of your locomotor skills did they do going always just straight ahead? And I will challenge you that if I went and watched your warm-up, I bet you most of your warm-up, they're doing all the high knees, kick the butt, but it's always going
front back
in this plane.
Yeah.
And yet, that's not the game. The game is going in this plane, backwards, up, down, sideways. But yet we don't pay attention to that. We just do the same routine over and over, and they're repeating the same movements. So you've got to really start to look at, are we working in all planes of the body? The same as the balance. Am I doing static balance? But am I also doing dynamic balance? Am I doing dynamic balance in different directions? Am I doing dynamic balance from landing? Right? So you got to start to look at the game. What is actually happening in the game? But then what am I doing normally? It's in your warm-up. And does it actually match?
Great. Yeah, great build. So just want to pull one of these out and show how just one of these, so leaping is not necessarily one, you would maybe pick some of the others, maybe running or jumping before leaping, but showing how influential, limitations that an athlete, if they have limitations around leaping, how does it impact that athlete and the skill set? So leaping, the definition of leaping is leaving one leg and landing on the other and moving through distance, okay? So looking at that and the ability to do that, and you think about all the other things that, it's beautiful. And so you think about all the things that component, the balance, the core strength that has going on with that, the balance, and you think in basketball, the additional contact and everything, but knowing that, it shows up in multiple sports. Leaping, you think of volleyball, leaping to go do and hit, long jumping, there's definitely leaving one foot, landing on 1 or 2 feet, depending on what kind of long jump you're doing, but it does show up in other sports, and in basketball, we see it often in a layup. Right, being able to leave one foot to the other in order to finish. And so that's where leaping transfers into a skill set that's actually quite important for us. And not only could they maybe have limitations within just a simple layup, let's say, but the decision making around the layup. And this is again going into that depth of impact of that FMS skills, of those FMS skills. And so we talk about decision making, and we'll talk about decision making a lot, and I think that has been a huge cultural change in our coaching within our country. And Monday we'll really dive in to how to get into that depth of a skill or phases of a skill and where decision making is in that. But I just want to talk about the impact of fundamental movement skills on being able to make a decision. And so the idea of, okay, being able to do a simple layup, and maybe for that fundamental, learn to train, but even at learn to train, you want to start to challenge them to get outside their comfort zone. But the idea of being able to take your layup steps diagonally and being able to leap through balance and be stable this way, or be able to brace contact, or be able to jump around a defender or through a defender in order to finish. And if they're missing that leap, and they have to think about that leap, it's not happening in their unconscious, then it's going to really be tough to make decisions and have to have their body think about being able to leap. Or it's not going to be in their unconscious, so when the defender's there, that they know they have that skill set, that it just comes to them to be able to be creative around that. And those are the limitations as coaches that we're going to put on our athletes if we do not spend time with these FMS. It's actually going to show up here for us. The time when, they're on a fast break and you can't understand why the athlete ran straight into the defense, like that's the decision they ended up making, and you're so boggled by it, I have no idea. Put on the responsibility hat. How am I responsible for that? Yeah, the athlete didn't make the decision, and that's what we see. But how am I responsible in that? Have I taught them the fundamental movement skills for them to make the right decisions? Right? And that's how that gets impacted. That's how we really integrate it.
Can I challenge you, coaches? I will guarantee you that if you're dealing with learn to train, and even train to compete, the majority of your athletes, when they go for a layup, they're going to take 2 dribbles here, and they're going to shoot their layup inside what we call the smile and straight up, because they can't do a leap from here and take 1 dribble and really leap into their layup, because they get away with taking 2 dribbles and just kind of shooting the ball straight up. But yet that will limit what they can do later on as help defense gets bigger, taller, and can extend. And you don't really see that sometimes, but a lot of times it's because they can't really extend and leap on, and then drive off that other foot. Okay, so it's there, but you have to really watch for it.
So going back to the LTAD and these stages, we look at prescribing how much time needs to be spent at each of these stages around FMS. And so, at the fun stage, the fundamental stage, we're talking the majority of practice. And so it doesn't have to necessarily look like going from sideline to sideline and, we're doing leaps. It doesn't have to come out that way. And that's where we go back to this whole integration around philosophy and games approach and integrating some of the loads within these things that we'll talk about over the next couple of days. But that when I as a check for myself, so whether I'm running an entire academy or a program or I'm running my individual team, checking on how much time I'm spending on these stages. But what I want you to note with FMS is it actually does not disappear. So it's not like you grow out of fundamental movement skills. They actually stay within. So our senior national teams do FMS skills. That is part of our training camp. And that shows up within our training. And it's sometimes even the reasoning behind the FMS skills. For sure, we've got athletes with gaps without a question. Because, this idea of building a perfect athlete and they're in a perfect cauldron hasn't yet existed. And so there are some gaps in their training that they're missing some of these FMS skills, or they might just have biological, pieces that makes it harder potentially to leap or jump, and that they have to work through those. But the emphasis here, when we're starting to get to train to compete and train to train, is actually moving towards injury prevention and lengthening their career. And because if you think about it, if they start losing the ability to jump or the ability to be able to get full movement in their leaps, you're actually shrinking the length of their career. And again, just like Mike said, you do not want to be the reason as to why they're not playing anymore. And it might, consciously, you obviously want them, your heart wants them to play, but what am I doing that might be causing that. And so, injury prevention is a big one. We think we get lucky to have Raptors in town and get a lot of time with that team and see what they're doing. They're one of the best in the league in terms of keeping athletes on the floor. Now, this year is a little bit of a different story, but up until this year, we definitely have been, and their staff is incredible. And they're some of the best, making sure. And if you ever get a chance, or if you're going to the game this week, I would encourage you to get there early to see some of the FMS stuff that those athletes are doing pre-competition, and with the purpose to keep their career at length, at the most optimal length. Because for them, that's $1 million that they're leaving on the table in American dollars. So for us, that's a lot of money.
But think about Kawhi Leonard. How many people follow Kawhi Leonard and how he doesn't play back-to-backs? I mean, that's ridiculous. Your best player, and you're not going to play him in a game? Well, why are they doing that? Because they want him for long term. And you know what's happening? They got the best record in the league. Right? Now, if they had been losing, everybody's going to say, oh, you got to be playing Kawhi. But they're thinking long term. We want Kawhi Leonard for the long term, not just for that next game. Right?
And for next year, too,
and for next year and the year after that, right? So, I mean, that's rare at that level, but it's proving that it's working, because it does work, thinking long term.
Good. So where does FMS show up quite often? It'll be in this idea around dynamic warm-up. Anyone here do dynamic warm-ups? It's pretty common now. But yeah, great. We'll give some demos, not the full warm-up, and honestly, you know, Mike and I were chatting about this early this morning, that you can find a lot of this stuff online. You don't necessarily need us to show you every single one. You just pull out your phone, Google it, and you can find lots of different examples of different dynamic warm-ups. But we'll talk about, again, what our commitment is this weekend is really weekend, it's Sunday, but the next few days is really to transfer some of the ideas of the why behind, so that when you Google it, you're choosing because you know why you're choosing it for the right who. And that's really our commitment with where we're going with all this. But prevention exercise and after lunch, Mike was going to show some of those, and just basic fundamental movement skills show up in those sort of 3 areas. So bumping through this, we're looking at specialization. Any questions on fundamental movement skills or physical literacy or transfer, or how that shows up? Feeling good. One thing I did jump over, and I just wanted to circle back on, is we've done sort of 2 what we call RAT exercises, so readiness, awareness, exercises, and that's when I got you to talk together and get into your groups. Why do we do that? Why is that important? Why would we try and facilitate that into this? What did that do? Any ideas around that? Yeah, take you out of the comfort zone for sure. Yep. No new people, communicating, absolutely. Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah, engaged. And one last one. Yeah, so it's really starting to test where you're at and where you're going. And so we purposely put those in because just like you, starting to touch and do and touch the material, apply the material, get you integrated into it, and we're doing that with you. That's what you want to do with your athletes in practice, right? So if you're staying there talking, and you're not integrating them into the learning, you're going to get that kind of result. If you want them attentive and if you want them integrated and ready to go within those environments, you need to build that within your practice plan. So, there's some reasoning, again, we thought about who we're dealing with and what we want to do in order to make sure that some of those things show up. Yeah.
So it's called a RAT, a Readiness Assessment Test. Are your learners ready? And it's what was your prior knowledge? By getting you talking, it's making you talk about your prior knowledge on the topic with someone else. Okay? And when you coach, always start with prior knowledge. And we'll show that as we go along. Every time you introduce something new, it really stresses the cognitive part of the brain. But if you can make it, oh, I know that, I've done that before, I've talked about that, it's not as stressful. Okay, so the more you can build on prior knowledge and you get people engaged, they're more comfortable to learn. It's a learning principle. And it's very, very powerful for us when we teach and coach.
Great, thanks. Good, so specialization, just second point here. So we're just gonna kind of do the same thing. So speaking of RAT, we'd like you to find someone new again and reflect, before you're meeting up with that partner, what I want you to do is sort of draw this line. So that black line, if you could just draw it on the paper, knowing that it's a continuum. And on one side, what I want you to reflect on is your philosophy. So this is sort of like a winning philosophy, and if I've got more of a developmental or development philosophy. So if I was like all the way on this side and I only did development, we actually didn't play games whatsoever, and that's what's going on. Or if I was all on winning, and maybe you run an AAU program, and that's the way you function things, right? And so figure out where you're at on that, and just kind of share it with that individual. And if you have to get up, you have to get up. That's okay. That works for me too. I'm just going to start to pull it out, and I think this is one of these topics that we can even transfer onto our breaks and transfer into our lunch, because you can probably talk about this for quite a while about how this goes. And this is actually one of the components that we have in our Learn to Train coach evaluation. And this task of trying to figure out where you are on this curriculum, and not because necessarily it matters that much to the evaluator, in some circumstances we'll see, but how does that transfer to what you actually do, right? So if I said, I was maybe just at that green-black intersection and that's where my philosophy was, but then you go into practice and you see behaviors, and the way practice is run that actually lines up with what's happening on that winning side, I might in my mind feel like I'm doing development, but what I actually do might not line up with where my philosophy is. And working with our coaches to be able to know their philosophy and be able to execute that. So I encourage a lot of those continued conversations. What would a very far right development, what is that? So we often talk about what does this look like, what does it sound like, what does it feel like? But what does that look like on the development side? What would you imagine if you walked in, as coaches and with all this knowledge, walk into a practice, someone else's practice, and you're like, yeah, that's where their philosophy is as a coach. What are some of the things you're seeing? Individual stuff, one-on-one, great. Some fundamental stuff would come through. Yep, some fun stuff, could definitely be coming through, absolutely. Sorry? Some risk-taking, encouraging the risk-taking, fun for kids. Games so those are some of the things. What would you see on the far right there, or your left? Okay, could be very competitive. Sorry? Could be structured. Yeah, could be. The intensity may or may not rise. I would challenge that you could develop through intensity as well, but for sure, that's not missing on that side, that's for sure. So what I'm going to encourage you or challenge you to do with this is, and something that we've started to do within our national team programs, is this idea around developing through winning. Where can we marry, or how can we marry both, and what does that look like? And so, looking at training and developing through competition. And so, building on that idea of what does that look like, it's things like going into World Championships, not necessarily focused on trying to pull down a medal, but actually to develop through the process of getting towards that medal. But if we don't medal, that's okay. Our commitment is to the development through the process of trying to win. And so that's a very, very different mentality as a coach. And those of you that coach within competition, you know how that switches, and that those pressers and maybe even your timeout conversations start changing when you have that different philosophy. So what does that look like for us? That looks like in our development programs or our development national teams, when you get selected to that national team, you're looking at that very elite side. So who we're coaching is that very elite side of the LTAD. And if you get put onto that team and we're developing through winning, that means those players are playing. So yes, we're at the highest level competition for maybe train to train or train to compete in the entire world. But we're going to develop those players through competition. And so not necessarily even competition, as in even minutes, but minutes. You make the team you're playing. And because we're committed to your development in that competition environment. And so I think of one of the first teams I saw at a World Championship that when I first got the job here at Canada Basketball, it's about almost 7 years ago now. And we went to Amsterdam for the World Championships, and we had our cadet team. And this is, cadet was still new, under 17, under 16 is still quite new at that time. And we started to implement, and Mike and myself were there, and we started to implement this philosophy. So we chose athletes. There's one athlete under the age of under the height of 6 feet, and they were, some of them were 6'2" and 16 or 17 years old, the girls, and they were awkward. Like watching a transition was sometimes a really painful observation. And we said, whether we win a medal or not, what we're going to do is we're going to develop these players through this competition, and that was our commitment. And so we actually led that tournament in turnovers. And a lot of those were travels, and it was because it was like bodies that they didn't know how to control, late developers that, still trying to figure out their body. And so we led the entire tournament in turnovers. We surely won that category. But we also won it in rebounds, which started to get quite interesting. Now, normally you would think, great, that's an extra possession, but what often would happen is a rebound, dribble, step, off foot, turnover. So, there was that sort of stuff. But we were committed to still allowing those players to do that in the highest level competition in the world. That was okay. to be doing that because we wanted to develop them through that environment. And so that part is a very different change in that philosophy. What it looks like on the men's side, so just recently, if you don't know, I'm really proud to tell you that we won the world championship. We're pretty happy about that at the under 19 level in Egypt. Yeah, thank you. That's our first ever. We're really proud of that. And again, that group of individuals is actually those guys that are looking to just about enter the draft this year, which is a really, really exciting group. If you haven't followed them, if you can't avoid the R.G. Barrett news and all of the other ones. But that group is again, one of our first sort of, we had an academy where we were developing and we started to implement a lot of these FMS and fundamental basketball movement skills with that group. And now we get to see the product, which is really cool, as well as a world championship. But with that group, another developing through Wenting, Roy Rano's the coach there. And if you don't know RJ, he's our biggest prospect in this classification year. And a great athlete and great with Canada basketball. And so, but if you've watched this game at all, he's left-handed. And so we're going down the stretch in a semifinal game, and the difference what kind of podium we had the possibility of standing on. And it was a play where we had the ball at the sideline on our end in our court, and RJ had scored quite a few points in that game, and so ideally you want to give the ball to RJ. And one of these choices, this development for winning, if I wanted to win the game, I would set it up in maybe a handoff situation so that he could go to finish to his left, because he's definitely better at his left-hand hand. But what we had to think about, and what Roy did a really great job of, is that's great at under 19, but what layup do we want him to be able to take when he plays senior? Like when we get to the Olympics and we want to get on that podium, do we want to only be able to run something to his left? And so we need to set it up for him to be able to go either way, right? And him to be able to make the decision and have the ability to be able to go in his right in a semifinal game in a world championship, right? And those are the types of decisions that we work with and within our philosophy. And it's okay if he misses it. But what has started to happen for us is that we end up with world championships, right? And we start developing these players, and we're looking at the person. We're looking at RJ and where we want to help him get to in his career and try to provide him those opportunities in a very stressful situation to be able to work with both hands and not just limit him to what he has as a strength in that moment. So those are some of the examples on how that works. Any builds on that?
Well, generally, I always tell coaches, look, development, think of that early, winning late. So in our career, think about developing early in a career, winning late in the career. But also think in the season. Early in the season, what am I going to spend more time on? Development. As I get to the playoffs, I can focus more on the winning. But also in your practice. Early in practice, a lot of development. Late in the practice, we're competing our drills a little bit more. The biggest thing that I find about the winning one is, and I can watch your team and I'll tell you if you're winning or not when I go to a game, is playing time and restrictiveness. If you're restricting players in what they can do because you're afraid of the turnover or afraid if they will miss the shot, you're thinking about winning. And if you're restricting playing time because you're afraid that that player's not going to help you win, that'll show up. And I struggle with our cadet coaches, especially junior coaches, all the time on this one. We have a girl in our country who's 6'6". Do you know how many girls there are in Canada, or females, who are 6'6"? That are 6'6" and like basketball, that are 6'6" and actually play basketball, and are 6'6" and are actually coordinated? There's one. She's on the team. She's on the team. I'm sorry, she's on the team. Okay? But the coaches struggle with how do we play her because she's 6'6" and she doesn't do our dynamic one-on-one or 5-0 pass cut fill, and she doesn't fit that. And I go, it doesn't matter, she's playing. Figure it out. Okay? So even at our level, I still have to deal with that because she's the player. She's Cambridge, she's Griner. There's only 2 of those in the world. There's only 2 of them. We got one who might be like that. But it's going to be when she's 25, 26, 27 when it finally shows up. It's not going to be when she's 17, 18 years old. Okay? So that's where it really shows up, this winning is, are you restricting people in playing time and limiting what they're allowed to do when they're younger? Because it might cost you the game.
Question? So the question is, when do you integrate behaviors into performance? So like evaluate behaviors? Yeah, I'll answer and then you can answer. But to me, when you say performance, I'm just going to back it down to like that fundamentals, learn, train, train to train stage, and performance might look a little bit different. But I would say that that's integrated into your practice environment if you wanted to show it up into a game. And so if that's something that you're evaluating, it's important to you in your game, you want them to behave, aggressively, whatever your values are within your team, that's something that needs to show up and be emphasized within your practice. And to me, you start it right away. And what those values are might look different, right? As they age, the values might actually change a little bit, or you might add more. But I would say right away, first touch, you start talking about that leadership piece. And we'll do some demos around integrating leadership in how can you get athletes to be accountable within drills. And it looks, and it actually feels a lot different as a coach when you start integrating, but it's a really good point that you brought up there. Yeah.
So
okay.
To me, it's around holding your athletes to a high standard with assurances. There's a slight difference there. So we talk about is everybody in our culture, our training environment, has to hold each other to a high standard, but with an assurance. An assurance means I believe in you, and I know you can do this. What I see, there's a lot of coaches who like to think we hold people to high standards, but the coach can't hold themselves to a high standard, and they use intimidation, bullying, because they don't know how to control the situation, so they get mad and they yell at the athlete. Or you get a coach, a very high-level coach in the NCAA now, who's pushed an athlete, who's now trying to make it sound like that's okay because people today can't handle people holding them to a high standard. No, that's the coach can't control their emotions, right? So if we're going to hold people to high standards, you have to be able to do it with an assurance, which is I believe in you and you can do this. So we'll be demonstrating some of that as we go.
So just, I'm sure a lot of you have heard, in terms of specializing early, and I know England does a good job with this communication in general, but, these are some of the outcomes or the consequences of early specialization. So, one-sided sport-specific preparation, we saw that with the chart and all the different sports, and how you get different things from different sports, and if you don't go into those sports, then you might not get some of those, right? And so it's a one-sided prep going on. Of course, the lack of the fundamental movement skills, overuse injury, right? If they're playing a single sport all year round, and we're a late developing sport, our peak for sports for basketball is really 28, 29, 30, up to 32, depending if you're male or female. And so if those are the peak ages, and at 8, 9, 10, they're holding schedules that are equal to what an NBA does, and again, questionable whether that's for the athlete, if what they're doing is for who is there, knowing the who, or if what's driving what in that circumstance. But yet we apply that to the youth. That's where overuse injuries start to occur, and you're actually, again, killing their career and their opportunities by what you're doing. Early burnout's a big one, and early retirement from training. We've started to really talk about at that learn to train and train to train. Again, our geography is very much different than everybody else's, but limiting at learn to train, how far do you really need to travel for competition, versus at train to compete, how you do need to travel for meaningful competition. And that's another one of those LTAD components, but the idea around competition and what does that look like at different stages, and what are the geography and how far do you need to travel, and how does that impact burnout? Because then when you do need to travel, the athletes are missing all the birthday parties, missing all their families' Christmases and holiday events, and having to move birthday parties to different days because they've been doing it already for 15 years and they get over it. They're burnt out around that. And so taking that away from them at a young age might be fun to travel to another country to do that, but what impact are you making on them long term when they do have to sacrifice that to get to a world championship? We have conversations with national athletes that are like, I've done this for years, I'm over it. That slide in the hotel pool is not that fun anymore. It's not that novel. I see it every weekend, right? And what kind of impacts do those travel schedules really do? So we've also taken a pyramid approach to skills. And so when we look at a skills pyramid, we look at fundamentals, which is fundamental movement skills, but also fundamental basketball skills. So we think about the basic skills around basketball. Then we look at technical. So here now we're looking at specific skills that actually include decisions. So remember before I told you we'd talk a lot more about how decision is impacted within the skill and how it's actually through the depth of that skill itself. Strategy now is that long-term plan that you're making within your team. So what are the long-term strategies towards your style of play, to execute your style of play in those game situations? And then the tactics are those short-term things you do to your long-term plan, right? So if your long-term plan maybe is to zone the inbound, the baseline inbound, some teams do that. My short-term might be to trap the first pass. Right? So it's a short-term adjustment that impacts that long-term plan. And so if you take a look and trying to work and help coaches, we've got here, we've got the LTAD stages, and then we've got our skills. And if you kind of see how the pyramid's sliced, when you take a look at fundamentals, really what you should be working on are fundamental skills and fundamental basketball skills. Sometimes you'll go into maybe a 10-year-old's practice, and they're actually spending a whole bunch of time on tactics. Right? Different ways to adjust different plays based on who they might be competing against this weekend. And they're spending all this time on tactics, or even time on strategy where they're in the 5-on-5 and trying to run this offense 5-on-0s to make sure that they understand. But when you kind of take a look at that long term, again, the commitment is not about the game that's coming up in 3 days. The commitment is to the long-term development of the athlete, and it's very, very different. What you do is going to look very, very different based on those two things, right? And so that's where this gives a little bit of a guide. And so what that actually looks like, so I did a pull-out of Learn to Train. 20% here on fundamental movement skills, 20% on basketball skills. We got 20% on the technical, so again, that's skill development, but multiplayer and then also individual, so making sure you're touching on both. And then as a coach, taking this guide, taking a look at your practice plan, just doing a self-check. Mike just started to touch on the idea of accountability of the coach. We really want to go in and have accountability for our athletes, but again, putting on that hat of where am I responsible in all of this? Am I accountable to their development as well? And then 10% on offense, defense around strategy, so that long-term plan. So, what that looks like in 90 minutes, 53 minutes is spent on this. That's what that actually looks like. And then we've got 7 minutes on strategy at that Learn to Train stage. So, that's 9 to 11-year-olds. And is that really what we're doing in order to make sure that when they get to train, that stage, that they have that part of the pyramid so they can spend some time and know how to do a skill and make a decision on that skill when they start getting put on in more strategy, and that starts getting loading on them. So this is basically what it looks like, and I know people, the next question is often, what does it look like at this stage? And so that's what this looks like, and what our recommendations are for each age and stage around the LTAD when it comes to that pyramid. And building on that too, this sort of 60-40 is, and 70-30 is practice versus competition, and then what does that competition look like? So Learn to Train looks at 3-on-3, 4-on-4 competitions at that stage, and that's what that competition looks like. So also guides in terms of how to structure those. So third one here is developmental age. And this part, I think, we started talking about this a little bit, and your question about what happens if they're not actually at that age in some of those areas. So that's where we're going to dive into this a little bit. So I'm just going to get you to, Alex, is this speaker connected? Do you know? Through the... It's actually okay. I can do it with, we'll play it through once and it's okay. Yeah, so I'm just going to get you to watch this film. So this should just... Okay, so case in point, right? I'm gonna get you to watch it one more time because I mean it's pretty tempting just to watch the throwdowns that are occurring. But I'm gonna get this group, we're gonna watch it one more time, and what I'd like to look at is actually take a lens, a coach's eye, to the video, and I want you to take a look at the opposing team. So I want you, now looking at the eye of development, what's happening for those athletes in terms of development? So just, you're looking at the team that's playing against the early developer here. You guys are going to take a look at the team that the early developer's on. So you're not looking at the actual athlete. I want you to look at what skills are sort of being developed with those that are on the team of that early developer. And this group, what you're going to take a look at is actually the early developer. So you get to watch the hits again and take a look at what is that athlete developing in this circumstance, in this situation. So I'll see.
You see your tongue.
Sorry? Yeah, I just saw it there. Yeah, I have to whip through. I don't have to show all of it, probably. Okay, so what were some of the things that you guys have observed with the opposing team? What are some of the things you saw around development? Right. Yeah, so watching some of them just slow down because they don't want to deal with it, not really doing their defensive responsibilities. They're kind of all going towards the early developer, but not actually even wanting to engage it. Yeah. Right, so because they're going narrow, they're not developing the spatial awareness that might be needed to actually develop through the game. Developing courage, so that potentially the ones that don't step up, the ones that do, might develop some courage or injuries. Yeah. So there's a decision. They are put in a position of decision. Maybe have the skill set to be able to stop, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't even matter if they do have the skill set. Right, and maybe the technique around the tackle might get impacted because of what's going on. Last one, yeah? Right, so the other team is dealing with loss and the idea around learning to lose. Okay, so what's going on? What kind of development things are going on with the players of the early developer, or early developer? What did you guys observe? Yeah? Yep. Watching and not involved. So skill sets, maybe not, they don't get to apply them in a competition environment. Team, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so their attitude was just like, he'll do it. That one player will do it, yeah. Yeah, fun and engagement level, lower. Yeah, you can kind of see them walking through. Yeah, and so Alex just commented that often you look at that and you think that athlete's extremely talented, but is it talent or is it actual physical ability, right? Is that actually the technique? And I'm going to tell you right now, I am not rugby, but I thought maybe you guys would be able to tell me what's going on. But, mistaking that as talent in that, if I am running through a bunch of people that actually don't stop me, and I don't actually have to dodge, I literally can run right through them. Is that developing a skill set that's going to be needed when there's someone that can actually stop, right? And that just kind of builds onto this. Yep. Yep. Wrong attitude of what's going on, later going on. And so, just repeating, that athlete will start to get with athletes of their same development age, and that's going to create an impact there. So I'm just going to move through because there's a couple other things that I want to share. And what does that look like in basketball, right? This is what it starts to look like in basketball, in relating it. And it could look like this. It could also look in some other formats as well. But these are some of the things that we see. And knowing who you're coaching, right? And Mike started to talk about this tall, what we call tall talls. So they're not tall players, they're tall players. And there's very few of them. And knowing who they are, why they're playing, in order to know what you're doing and how you're going to do it is extremely important to their existence. Because we've seen this and commented on it a few times, put them under the key, and that's perfect. But when we do stuff like that, those are the things that happens to their development, but also not their development, the people around them, right? And those around them, kind of like Alex was saying, might be one of the players that need to be identified later, right? So what are we doing with some of these players, and how are we doing this? And so that really looks at these ages we started to talk about biological and development age. And so biological age, like I mentioned before, is starts at the day you're born, and your biological clock starts going. Development age is actually includes the development of your actual body, so your skeletal development, puberty. It also includes cognitive development, emotional development, so the psychological development around that, and that might be a different age than my biological age, right? And that's what we are kind of alluding to, that those ages might not add up. And so we actually have quite a few ages. We have more that go along with that. So we got the chronological, biological, we've got development age, we've got the training age, the year to which that athlete started training seriously. And it might not even be in my sport, because we saw how a lot of those things transfer. And so who here has a roster of their team and you put their biological age down there? Who has that sort of set up, right? And I think when we do that, we're slimming on who we are coaching. Do we also know within those 12 or 15 players, whatever you're carrying, do we know what their training age is? Do we know what their development age is? Do we really know who they are in order to make sure that we know what we're going to do for that season? Because if all of a sudden you had a whole bunch that their development age was really, really low, well, you would probably look at where in that development age they're low, and if it's in the social emotional, you better believe that you want to try and ramp that up within your practice schedule. And how is that included within my practice schedule? So relative age is also another one where you start taking your team and how are they, with the same biological age group, how do they relate compared to the other, right? So I've got, maybe a whole bunch of 13, 14-year-olds, but I've got a whole bunch relative to the others that are like 17, and I've got 3 of them that act like 9-year-olds. Right? Or behave like 9-year-olds, or have fundamental skills like 9-year-olds, and relatively they're actually a lot younger, even though their biological age on my roster says they're the same age. So what do I do is different? If I've got some, how do I adjust the practice or those IPPs, the individual performance plans, how do I adjust those to help them get to where we need them to go? Skeletal age, And we have quite a few laws in Canada, so we actually can't take a look at it. We start going on the eye test as to where we think their skeletal age is, but there's other countries, Turkey's one of them, where in their national team camp they'll do a radial x-ray, and they keep the actual skeletal, knowing how far that growth plate is from closing, knowing how much more they have left to grow, and then so they keep track of their skeletal age. And sport-specific training age. Again, within that group of 13, 14-year-olds, how long have been the training? What age do they have on their sport-specific training? And again, that's going to change what you're going to do if you actually know who your athlete is. So I would say when you go to make that roster, it actually should have several ages to really know who your athletes are. And the final one is the one, as coaches, we always talk about, is this basketball age, the IQ age, right? And we say, oh, they just know the game. But can we put some numbers down that? How is that compared to the rest on your team? And if I've got 3 that know it, as a coach, can I challenge myself to get them all up to the appropriate age? Or, maybe I go into those northern territories and I'm working with 14-year-olds and their basketball IQ is like a 9-year-old. And can I leave that session with them at a 10-year-old's IQ? Can I do that with them? Right? And really start to know who you're coaching and make some of those adjustments. Were you going to say something?
I'll give you a real example. So last February, we go into Calgary, a city in Alberta, and I did a talent ID and training session, and there was a young woman there who was 6'4". Okay? She had only been in Canada about a year, and we're doing this clinic, and I'll be honest, if you were based on basketball, she should never have been there. She really struggled.
Her age was low.
Really struggled. Okay, but she's 6'4", and she probably has a wingspan of a 7-footer. So it comes to invitations to our cadet camp. She's probably one of the first person I'm inviting. And of course, people are like, Mike, she can't play. I go, she's only played basketball since January. I mean, literally, that tryout she came to was the second event she had been to in basketball. So when she comes to training camp, every drill she does what? She improves because she's just learning the game. By the end of the camp, the coach is like, wow, Filipina's going to be a player. I go, yes, because you have to recognize she's only had less than a year of basketball, her basketball, right? Whereas somebody who's been playing since 9 years old, how much of a window do they have? Right? And especially at the younger ages, if you have one player who's played a year and then they go to the next year and there's somebody brand new and that opening tryout, wow, this player really looks good. Well, is it because they played the game and they're comfortable with it, or are they actually really good? You have to be really careful about how many years of basketball experience someone has. And what did their past coach teach them? Right? Did their coach just throw them out there and they run up and down for it, or did they have somebody actually work with them? So be very careful judging talent also on, do they know the game? That's not talent. That can just be their basketball experience.
And that's why all of those ages are actually quite important in order to know who you're actually coaching. And so I think that's a great emphasis. So here, some of the things around early matures, they tend to rely on aggression, which we saw through the video, right? Maybe not the skill set, and it relies more on the aggression and physicality as opposed to the skills. And then if we go back to that pyramid and how much at that age and stage should be focused on skill sets, and they're actually not getting that in competition, right? And so are we actually doing them justice in those scenarios? And again, when we start getting early matures, in an environment, so Mike talked about when you referenced, the 15-year-old that has a body of, 18 or 9 or 19-year-old, we get into this tendency of applying adult concepts onto the 15-year-old. You still need to know who you're coaching. It's really important you don't lose that so that they really get the maximum of the development. And I think we started to touch on competition, and this is a model I'm starting to work with, is this idea of what does it look like, what does the LTAD look like with competition? And so now with our 3x3 game really coming into play, what does that look like at the active start stage, and how does it start differentiating between the two? And literally, if we go into this spot right here, who is that athlete and what is the competition? Knowing who it is, what is the competition we need to build for them so that they can really excel? And is it an athlete that actually appears on both sides in the 3x3 LTAD as well as the 5-on-5 LTAD, and can they jump back and forth, and do we have programs that allow, does our competition structure allow for that in doing that in this redesign with a sport that's coming, is an Olympic sport now. So really looking at what they're doing all the way through, and how do we support all those types of competition throughout the LTA stage. So really talked about, I mentioned earlier about the look like, sound like, feel like, and applying that with coaches, applying that with athletes. But really want to talk about now some of these philosophies. Now that we've really dove into that first half of that equation, teaching players to memorize versus understanding a concept, right? And just put on your imagination hat or your visualization hat right now, and think in your mind, when you're teaching players to memorize, what does that look like? Right? I'm in practice and I'm having them do the same pattern over and over again. What does that look like? What does it feel like as a coach? Often it looks kind of like military set. It's very clean. Everyone knows their rotations. They're doing the layup, and it's at that speed. And as a coach, it feels very neat and tidy, right? What does it sound like? It might, sound like order, and people know where they're going. Versus maybe, in terms of understanding a concept. What does that feel like? It feels like balls are rolling everywhere. It feels like a little bit messy, and being comfortable with messy, and messy's okay. Right? There's confusion, there's mistakes being made. And so really trying to try on that visualization, what does that look like? So that when you're as a coach and I'm running practice, and if that's what I'm trying to do in that moment, sometimes there's needs for both. But when I'm in that movement, I can step back and wait, is this what I want it to look like? Is this what I want it to sound like? And it helps you error detect and assess what's going on to make some of the changes. And again, being married versus a practice running well, versus something that might translate to a game. I'm just going to hold the questions because we're almost done. We'll do it just right at the end. I just want to touch on two more things before the end here to make sure that things flow for the afternoon. Also, when you go into planning, this is the idea, there's 4 pillars when we're going to build an athlete. So for sure, physicality and physical is one of them, and we know the importance in that. Technical and tactical, right, going back to that pyramid, skills and understanding that long-term plan is important. How much time am I spending on that? Social emotional build. When I'm building my program, how much time is on the social emotional activities? And then mental training around goal setting, around keywords, visualization, those sort of things fitting into the mental. So again, making sure that these are showing up in my practice. Like, look at my week. Is it within my practice? How much do they all show up? Look for my whole year. Look within an individual practice, and do those components show up? And so the other way to start adjusting the activities that you're doing on practice in order to fit in all of these things we've just talked about is this idea about loading a drill. And as coaches, we do this naturally. Like, we'll start a drill and then we'll put some sort of restraint or constriction, or add something to it, and we load the drill to change it just slightly. But what I'm going to challenge us to do is to look at, I chose that load or that restriction or that element because of something very specific. And so when we go to teach loads, we teach them that there's 5, used to be 4, I'm just playing with the 5th right now, but 5 different potential loads that you can put on an activity, a drill, a teaching, whatever you want to name that. And so they are physical, could be a physical load, a social emotional load, a mental load, a technical load, a competitive load. And some examples are those, what that might look like. With that physical, could be like a FMS or SAQ, any of those speed, agility, quickness. Could be strength. It could be something around core and stabilization. And then the technical, it might be a secondary decision. There was a primary decision. Now I'm having the athlete complete the primary decision, and now I'm adding a secondary decision. Can they do both within that skill set? Mental, we start talking about, adding pressure. So it could be a clock. It could be getting something done within a certain amount of time. So when we have a situation, external pressure. Or social emotional here, it could be through connections. It could also be through communication. So being very conscious of, I am making this adjustment to my activity to hit on one of these very purposefully. Now, one of the things that we've started to note, and one of the things we do is working with high performance, is trying to get what our gaps are. And one of the things that we saw that we were gapping on an international stage was around competitiveness. So when we're seeing the top teams in the world, either our competitiveness doesn't equal, or we falter under competitiveness, or our competitiveness is not as consistent. So for us, a very easy person to compare with, or team to compare with, is the US. We're border to border, we see them often, we see them within our tournaments, and so we were seeing that our competitive level might not be where we want it to be, and that's where we want to be top in the world. And so then the challenge is, okay, well, how do we integrate it into the entire LTAD so that it actually shows up within our national teams? And so this is, I got a chance to spend some time with the UNC women's basketball team, so I spent about 7 or 8 weeks there this fall with that idea. This was my task. This is what I want to do, is try and find how competitive, how we can take this as a load. And so it was a great experience with the women's basketball team, but I also got a chance to sit with Anson Dorrance. And so he's got books out, and he's actually the head coach of the women's UNC soccer team, and has won 15 of 17 national championships in the NCAA, and talks a lot about what he calls a competitive cauldron within his environment. And so some of the things that I pulled from there is this idea of there's 3 types of competition when I do a competition load. One of them is competing against myself. So it's either a number that I'm trying to compete against myself, or it's a previous number that I've created that I'm now trying to compete against my previous standard. Against someone else. So it could be Mike against myself. I'm competing against what I'm trying to get versus what Mike's trying to get. So it's me against another. And then finally, in a situation where it's team versus team. So when I go to load in a drill, I'm thinking about what is the type of competition that I'm loading, and do I always go to one of them? Am I actually providing opportunities for all 3 of those to exist? And also, depending on who I'm coaching in that LTAD, are some of these better suited for those ages? So it's not that competition can't show up in development for fundamentals, but the type of competition would be different. Against myself is a very healthy competition for youth, right? And you can start to integrate teaching competition. What we don't want in Canada is that our fundamental coaches to go in and start doing some of these others. And then the important part about competition is the idea around tracking. Excuse me. And there's 3 ways to track. So one, through technology. So it might be, through speed gates. It's a way. It might be through a timer on a watch, and you're using technology in order to track some of these things. The other way is obviously a coach or staff observed. It could be live, or it could be afterwards through video, that those things can be observed. And then we talk about player reported. So it could be just that the onus is on you to report your score, and you actually player report. And again, am I always doing one way? And can I make sure that I'm integrating multiple ways? So that's also another way to take a look at that. So what, we're just kind of wrapping up here, but what I would challenge you over the lunch break here is to try and sit with someone or sit with a group of people and find a drill that you do enjoy doing. So what's a drill that it's kind of your go-to, you tend to kind of pick this one out, and can you challenge yourself to take one of those 5 loads and purposely say, I want to load a social emotional. And this is what I'm going to do in order to do that. And then do a next load. So I'm also going to load physical, right? And I'm also going to load a tactical. And just being very purposeful with your design of that load on that drill that you're starting to do. And so I'm going to challenge you over lunch to see if you can start to work on this, and we can debrief that when we get back. Any questions with that activity? Sure, says Alex. A couple things I just want to share with you here is where to get more information. So slides are good, but like I said, so much of this stuff is accessible. So a couple websites are Canada Sport Government has what we call National Coaching Certification Program. Coach.ca is their website. They've got lots of resources there. Stand clear. They also have stuff through FMS and Fundamental Movement Skills. Game Plan is a website that we've developed at Canada Basketball. So anytime we do speaking engagements, or we've got coaches that go in and they've done think we've got close to 600 videos now. Anytime we do educational anything, we put it onto that website. As well as there's documents and different reference materials there as well. And then Canadian Sport for Life also has some things around LTAD. Basketball.ca, we do have a coaches link there that has some nutritional stuff. And then the coaching, our Canada Basketball Coaching has a Twitter, so we'll put out different activities or different tidbits of information through that Twitter handle. This is the game plan website, so it just kind of lines up what you can get. It's 125 Canadian dollars in order to access that, and that's available to go and do that if that's something that interests you. Finally, I just also wanted to mention we do, one of my commitments to our coaches in Canada is to help their development. And so created this weekend that we call Canada Basketball's NCCP Super Clinic. And for us, it's coaches all levels across our country, internationally. Canada, sort of like you guys, we only border one country. So we get a lot of American influence. And that weekend, what my commitment is to bring specialists in from around the world to be able to, help with our geography. And, it's a celebration of education, of sharing. It's a really fun environment. We offer all of our NCCP courses. So there's like 11 different schedules you can choose to go do, from professional development streams for learn to train and train to train stages, or professional development for train to compete and learn to win stages. All of our courses are there, people from across the country, our national team coaches there, and the idea is to share and learn. And that's the environment and the commitment I do for that weekend for our coaches in our country. So you're more than welcome to come. Early bird prices are up there. I know we had 2 from England, I think that came over last year. It was great having them and forming those relationships. So we welcome all of you to come. And if you have any questions around that, more information is on Game Plan and the Canada Basketball website. So we're just sort of finishing up, and I just wanted to put this up here. This is a way what we use to debrief. And we use it with our athletes, we use it within our staff, and probably now that I put it up here, you're going to hear Mike and I use it when in talking with you guys. And it's a way to help build that social emotional around communication. And so we say A, B, C, D, and A is agree, B is build, C is challenge, D is depth. And it's really important, in order to start exercising these, that it's always executed responsibly and making sure that they're really respectful when they go to do all of those things. And so you want to build on it a little bit?
See, that's good. So we use this with the athletes, and we use it with coaches, and we use it in meetings. So when we ask questions or we make comments, we use it as a way to encourage, I call them abrasive conversations. How do you have those difficult conversations? That's important. And this is a way to start to teach our athletes and our coaches how to have those kind of conversations. So an example may be, Dawn, what did you learn from this clinic today?
So I might say that England is actually quite versed in the LTAD and has a lot of background. Their coaches have a lot of background in development.
So then what I may do is go to another athlete. Does anybody want to build on what she said? So in other words, or I say, how many agree? Any challenges? Anybody want to build on that? So you're starting to allow people to communicate, and it's a really positive way. And I'll demonstrate that today and tomorrow when I'm working with the athletes, so you can see that. Because it's getting their voices out there. It's very important.
Good. So maybe we'll do questions starting off this afternoon. We'll do questions, and Mike and I are here as well. So good. Thanks so much for all of your attention and input and being interactive throughout this morning and being able to get through a lot of this. We really, really appreciate it. And looking forward to the next couple days.
Thanks, Dawn and Mike.
Thank you.
Let's give them a hand.